Introduction. The conversation you have been avoiding. Let me start with a question, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before you answer it, because the honest answer is the only one that will do you any good here. When was the last time you hesitated before speaking English? Not because you did not know the words, not because you were unsure of the grammar, but because you were worried about how you sounded. Maybe it was in a meeting at work. You had the idea, and you knew exactly what you wanted to say. You had rehearsed it in your head twice already, run the sentence structure, checked the vocabulary, but someone else spoke first, and you told yourself it was fine, you would jump in next time. And then the next moment came, and that too slipped by, and the meeting ended, and you walked back to your desk carrying something heavy, something that felt a lot like defeat, but that you couldn't quite name. Or maybe it was on a phone call. Someone asked you to repeat yourself. Just once, just a simple, sorry, could you say that again? But instead of simply repeating yourself, you felt a wave of heat rise through your chest, into your throat, up behind your eyes. You felt exposed, embarrassed, like something was broken inside of you that needed to be fixed before you were allowed to participate fully in the world around you. Or maybe it was something smaller. A cashier gave you a slightly confused look, and a colleague tilted their head when you said something. And for the rest of that day, you replayed that moment on a loop, editing and re-editing what you said, running alternate versions of the sentence in your head, wondering what you should have said differently, wondering why your voice, your actual, natural voice, does not seem to fit properly in the world you are trying to live in and work in and belong to. If any of that sounds familiar, I want to say something to you directly right now. And I want you to hear it not as comfort, not as the kind of warm reassurance that fades the moment the course ends, but as a statement of fact. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are not bad at English. You are overthinking your accent. And there is a very important difference between those two things. A difference that matters more than most people realize, and that has real consequences for how you show up in your professional life, your social life, and your own interior life. And this masterclass exists because that distinction matters. There is an entire industry built on the idea that your accent is a problem. Accent reduction courses, pronunciation coaching, elocution training, voice modification programs, all of it framed around the premise that the way you naturally speak is somehow deficient, that it is a liability that needs to be corrected, and that success in English requires you to sand off your edges until you sound like a voice that came from nowhere in particular, a voice without origin, a voice without history. I am not here to sell you that story. I am here to dismantle it. Over the course of this masterclass, we are going to do several things. We are going to examine the psychology of accent anxiety, what it is, where it comes from, and why it is so persistent, even in people who are objectively excellent, highly capable, the deeply fluent English speakers. We are going to look at what research actually tells us about how listeners process accented speech, and some of the results are going to surprise you. We are going to talk about the difference between clarity and accent, because they are not the same thing, and confusing them is at the very root of most people's self-doubt. Yet we are going to explore the concept of linguistic identity and why your accent is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature that carries real meaning and real power. And we are going to give you concrete, practical tools for communicating with greater confidence, not by changing your voice, but by changing your relationship with it. This is not a course about sounding more American. This is not a course about sounding more British. This is not a course about sounding like something you are not. And this is a course about getting out of your own way. Let us begin. To understand why so many people are paralyzed by their accents, we first need to understand what accent anxiety actually is and how it operates in the human brain. Accent anxiety is not simply being nervous about speaking. It is a specific form of self-consciousness that emerges at the intersection of language, identity, and social belonging. It is the fear that the way you sound will cause people to misunderstand you, dismiss you, judge you, mock you, or underestimate your intelligence. It is the belief, often unconscious, often deeply embedded, often invisible to the person holding it, that your accent reveals something unflattering about who you are, where you are from, or how much you belong in a given space. Now, anxiety of any kind is the brain's threat detection system misfiring. It is the amygdala doing its job, but doing it based on faulty data. When you feel anxious about speaking English, your brain is doing exactly what it is designed to do. It is scanning for danger, assessing the environment, preparing you to respond to threat. The problem is that it has learned somewhere along the way to classify your own voice as a source of danger. And once that classification is in place, every speaking situation becomes a potential minefield. Here is how it typically develops. Think back to the first time you remember feeling self-conscious about your accent. For most people, there is a specific moment, a comment someone made, a look someone gave, a situation in which communication broke down in a way that felt humiliating. Your brain registered that moment as significant. It filed it under a category that might be loosely translated as speaking with this accent in contexts like this leads to painful outcomes. And from that point forward, every time you opened your mouth in English, particularly in similar contexts, some part of your brain was on alert, watching, waiting, expecting history to repeat itself. This is called a conditioned response. It is the same mechanism that makes a person flinch if they have been startled in a particular place before. It is the same mechanism that makes someone anxious every time they see a dentist's chair, even when the dentist is kind and the procedure is routine. The brain does not wait to gather fresh evidence in each new situation. It uses old evidence. It assumes the past predicts the future. And it tries to protect you by making you hesitate, by making you over-prepare, by making you minimize the risk through minimizing yourself. The cruelest irony of accent anxiety is that it creates the very problems it is trying to prevent. When you are anxious about speaking, your voice changes, your throat tightens, your breathing becomes shallow, your pace becomes irregular, sometimes too fast, sometimes punctuated by long searching pauses. You start second-guessing words mid-sentence, which introduces genuine stumbles that have nothing to do with your language ability and everything to do with your nervous system. Your listener notices something is off, not because of your accent, but because you are audibly stressed. And your brain records this experience as further evidence that speaking is dangerous, that you were right to be afraid, that something went wrong. The cycle deepens with each repetition. Understanding this cycle is the first step to breaking it, and we will return to specific strategies throughout this course. But right now, I want to introduce you to the second major pillar of accent anxiety, because it does not only come from inside you, it also comes from the world around you, and it is important to name it clearly. We live in a society that has, for a very long time, assigned social value to certain accents and withheld it from others. This is not a new observation. Linguists, sociologists, and communication scholars have documented it extensively. If you grew up watching television and film in which certain accents were consistently portrayed as educated, authoritative, and trustworthy, and if your accent was not among them, then your brain absorbed that messaging the way it absorbs all social information, quietly, thoroughly, without you realizing it was happening, without your conscious consent. And if accents like yours were used to portray characters who were laughed at or dismissed, treated as less intelligent, or positioned as objects of pity or comic relief, then some part of your brain absorbed that too. It filed it under the category of social meaning. It learned what the culture said your voice was worth. This is called internalized linguistic prejudice. It is incredibly common. It is the reason why someone can be told by 100 different people that their accent is charming, warm, distinctive, and easy to understand, and still feel deep in their gut and that it is a liability. It is the reason why high-achieving professionals who are genuinely fluent in English, who have built careers in English-speaking environments, who communicate clearly and effectively by any objective measure, still feel like imposters every time they open their mouths in a room full of native speakers. The external feedback has changed. The internal programming has not. Internalized linguistic prejudice also explains why people from some countries and regions feel far more anxious about their accents than people from others, even when the objective levels of intelligibility are comparable. A French person speaking English with a strong French accent is statistically likely to feel significantly less self-conscious than a Vietnamese person or a Nigerian person speaking English with equally strong accents in the same room. And this is not because French accented English is objectively more intelligible. Research does not support that. It is because of which accents Western popular culture has historically coded as sophisticated, exotic, in an appealing way, worth imitating, and which accents it has coded as foreign, other, associated with poverty or struggle or lack of education. These are social hierarchies. They are not linguistic facts, and they have done an enormous amount of damage to an enormous number of people across generations. Naming this is important because you cannot challenge something you cannot see clearly. When your inner voice tells you that your accent makes you sound less intelligent, less professional, less worthy of being heard and taken seriously, I want you to know that voice didn't originate inside you. It was not born in you. It was placed there by a world that has not always been fair about which voices it amplifies and which ones it asks to be quieter. Recognizing that doesn't instantly dissolve the anxiety, but it is the beginning of no longer accepting it as truth. Here is where I want to pause the emotional and psychological conversation and look at the evidence. Because a lot of what people believe about accents and communication is simply wrong, not exaggerated, not slightly off, factually incorrect. And when you understand what the science actually shows, some of the weight you have been carrying starts to lift. Let us start with the most foundational question. Does a non-native accent actually make you harder to understand? The short answer is sometimes, in some situations, with some listeners, and far less than most people believe. Linguists and communication researchers have studied this question in depth over several decades. Or what they have found consistently is that intelligibility, the degree to which your speech can be understood, is only weakly and inconsistently correlated with accent strength. Some very strong accents are remarkably easy to understand. Some subtle accents can cause more communication breakdowns depending on the specific phonological features involved. Accent and intelligibility are related, but they are not the same thing, and the relationship between them is far more complex than it first appears. More importantly, intelligibility is not fixed. It is not a static property of a speaker. It changes based on context, familiarity, attentiveness, and the effort brought to the conversation. Or studies consistently show that listeners who are exposed to an unfamiliar accent for even a very short period of time, sometimes as little as a few minutes of conversation, significantly increase their comprehension of that accent. The ear learns, the brain adapts. The patterns that seemed opaque at first become clear with familiarity. This means that if you ever struggle to be understood in the first moments of a conversation, it is often not a permanent or structural barrier. It is a calibration period. It is your listener's brain doing what all brains do when encountering something new, adjusting, tuning in, finding the patterns. There is also substantial and important research on what linguists call the listener's responsibility in the communication process. Most of us, when communication breaks down, automatically assume the fault lies with the speaker. We were unclear. We used the wrong word. We mispronounced something. But communication is a two-way process. Intelligibility is co-created between speaker and listener, a listener who is actively engaged, who is willing to invest effort, who is not carrying existing prejudices about non-native speakers. That listener will understand a given speaker far more easily than a listener who has already decided before a word has been spoken that this is going to be difficult. And this brings us to the other side of the research, which is harder to hear but absolutely essential to understand. So some of the difficulty that non-native speakers encounter when communicating in English has nothing to do with their accent or their language ability. It has to do with listener bias. Research has repeatedly and robustly demonstrated that people who speak English with non-native accents are evaluated more negatively on measures of intelligence, competence, and trustworthiness, even when the content of what they are saying is identical to content delivered by native speakers. And this is not a perception based on what is actually being communicated. It is a bias that operates automatically, unconsciously, in the space before evaluation of meaning has even fully occurred. It is based on prejudice. It is based on unconscious social association. And crucially, it is based on the listener's limitation, not the speaker's. I say this not to make you feel hopeless about the world, but to reframe what the actual challenge is. Should the challenge is not primarily that your accent is a barrier to communication, the challenge is that you are sometimes communicating in environments shaped by bias, and you have been led to believe that you are the source of the problem when you are not fully the source of the problem. There is also a fascinating body of research on what is called mutual intelligibility, the ability of speakers with different accents or language backgrounds to understand each other. Or some studies show something genuinely counterintuitive. In certain scenarios, two non-native English speakers from completely different countries and language backgrounds can communicate with each other in English more easily than either of them can communicate with a native English speaker who is not paying particularly close attention. Why? Because both non-native speakers are accustomed to the effort of communication. And they have both had to work at being understood and at understanding others. They are both calibrated by experience to listen carefully, to ask for clarification without embarrassment, to fill in gaps intelligently, to check in when things are unclear. They bring a collaborative and effortful orientation to conversation that native speakers, who are often used to being understood effortlessly and who are sometimes less patient with ambiguity, do not always bring. And this finding has important implications for how we think about the role of English as a global language in the 21st century. English is no longer primarily a language used between native speakers. By most estimates, there are now more non-native English speakers in the world than native ones, and by some measures, the ratio is as high as 3 or 4 to 1. English has become, in a very real sense, and the world's shared second language, a vehicle for communication across enormous linguistic and cultural distances. And in that context, native speaker English is actually just one variety among very many, not the standard, not the target, not the superior form, simply one option among a rich global range. Understanding this reframes everything about the conversation. If you are a non-native English speaker, you are not on the periphery of English, but you are part of the overwhelming majority of English users worldwide. Your variety of English, accented, shaped by your mother tongue, inflected with the rhythms and sounds of your linguistic heritage, is a legitimate variety of world English. It is not a failed attempt at standard British or American English. It is English used in the way that billions of people use it, for the full range of purposes for which it is used. This chapter might be the most practically important one in this entire masterclass, so I want to take real time with it and make sure nothing gets lost. One of the most damaging confusions in the conversation about accents and communication is the conflation of accent with clarity. That people hear, you need to work on your pronunciation, and understand it to mean you need to reduce your accent. People hear, sometimes I find it hard to follow you, and translate it internally as my accent is too strong. But accent and clarity are very different things, and a great deal of perfectly intelligent, well-meaning advice about communication becomes harmful when this distinction is lost. Let me define my terms precisely. An accent is a set of phonological characteristics, vowel sounds, consonant sounds, stress patterns, rhythm, intonation contours that mark a speaker's speech as belonging to a particular regional or linguistic background. Every single person on earth speaks with an accent. There is no such thing as accentless speech. A standard American accent is an accent. Received pronunciation, the so-called BBC English, that is often held up as the gold standard of clear, educated speech, is an accent. Australian English is an accent. These are simply accents that, for historical and social and political reasons, have been granted the privilege of being treated as though they are neutral, as though they are simply clear speech, rather than one particular variety of speech among many. Clarity, on the other hand, is the degree to which your speech can be easily followed and understood by your intended listener. Clarity is affected by many factors: your rate of speech, your volume, your articulation, the complexity of your sentence structures, your ability to organize and sequence your ideas, your use of pauses, the way you signpost transitions. Accent is one factor among these many, and in many cases, it is not the most important factor, not even close. Here is a concrete example I want you to sit with. I want you to imagine two speakers. Speaker A is a native English speaker, or she has grown up speaking English, has spoken it her whole life, and her accent is unimpeachable, perfectly standard, entirely familiar. But she speaks quickly, she mumbles slightly, she uses a lot of filler words, and she tends to trail off at the ends of her sentences. Her volume drops when she gets to the important part of what she is saying. When she speaks, you frequently have to ask her to repeat herself. You often miss the second half of what she said, and you sometimes come away from conversations with her uncertain of what she actually meant. Speaker B is a non-native English speaker. He has a strong accent. His vowels are shaped by his native language. His intonation is not quite standard. There are features of his speech that immediately identify him as someone for whom English is a second language. But he speaks at a measured, deliberate pace. He pauses between ideas, that giving you time to process what you have just heard before the next thing arrives. He is precise in his word choices. He structures what he says with clear organization. He looks at you when he speaks, and he adjusts his communication when he sees any sign of confusion on your face. When he finishes a sentence, you understood every single word. You know exactly what he meant. Who is the clearer speaker? The answer is Speaker B, unambiguously. And yet Speaker B is the one who is far more likely to be told he should work on his English, that his communication needs improvement, that he would benefit from accent training. Speaker A's clarity problems are attributed to her style or her personality. Speaker B's, which are actually fewer, are attributed to his background. This is the double standard that the accent clarity confusion produces in practice, and it plays out in workplaces and classrooms and social situations every single day, often without anyone in the room fully recognizing it for what it is. So what are the actual components of clarity that every speaker, native and non-native, should pay attention to? Let us go through them in detail because these are genuinely high-value things to develop, regardless of what your accent is or where it comes from. Rate of speech. And this is probably the single most powerful variable in how easily any speaker is understood, and it is almost never discussed in accent conversations. When people are nervous or rushed, they tend to speed up. The words compress. The listener's brain does not have sufficient time to process one word before the next one arrives. The speech becomes a stream rather than a sequence of meaningful units, and comprehension drops. Slowing down even slightly, not dramatically, not artificially, and just measurably and intentionally, gives your listener time to keep up. It also gives you time. You make fewer stumbles. You have more access to the vocabulary you know is in there. You sound more composed, more confident, more deliberate. Slowing down is one of the highest return communication adjustments any speaker can make in any language. Pause. Related to rate of speech, but distinct and important enough to discuss separately. Pauses serve multiple crucial functions in communication. They signal the end of one idea and the beginning of the next, giving structure to your speech. They give the listener a moment to process and absorb what they have just heard before the next thing is added. They create emphasis. The pause before an important point signals to the listener that something significant is coming, and they give speech the kind of breathing quality that makes it feel like genuine communication rather than recitation. Most people who are anxious eliminate pauses entirely. The speech becomes a continuous, unbroken stream, and the listener struggles to find the shape of it. Restoring your pauses, even very brief ones, a second or two between major ideas, dramatically increases both the clarity and the perceived authority of what you say. Articulation. This does not mean speaking with an exaggerated or artificial precision, and it does not mean adopting a different accent. It means not swallowing sounds and not letting adjacent consonants blur together beyond recognition, not dropping final syllables and word endings. Good articulation does not require you to speak differently. It requires you to engage your mouth fully and consciously when you speak, rather than letting words form passively with minimal muscular effort. For many people, particularly those who are anxious, speech becomes very held, very flat, very minimized, and articulation suffers as a result. Volume and projection. And many non-native speakers, particularly those who are experiencing anxiety, speak more quietly than is optimal. They physically make themselves smaller. This forces the listener to work harder, to lean in, to strain to hear, to fill in sounds they couldn't quite catch. Raising your volume slightly, especially in environments with background noise, in larger rooms, or in video calls with imperfect audio, immediately reduces the cognitive load on your listener, and it also changes how you are perceived. Speakers who project are consistently rated by listeners as more confident, more authoritative, and more credible, regardless of what their accent is. Volume is not volume for its own sake. It is the signal that you are claiming space in the conversation. Organization and signposting. This is one of the most underrated clarity tools available to any speaker, and it costs absolutely nothing phonologically. But if a listener knows where your speech is going, if you have told them there are 3 points and you are currently on point 2, they can follow you with far less effort than if every sentence is a structural surprise. Simple signposting phrases like, I want to make 2 points here, or building on what I said before, or the key thing I want you to take away is this, do more for your intelligibility than any amount of work on individual vowel sounds. They give the listener a map, and with a map, the journey is always easier. Eye contact and responsiveness. In face-to-face and video communication, this matters enormously and is frequently overlooked in discussions about clarity. A speaker who makes genuine eye contact with their listener, who notices when there is confusion or hesitation on their face, who adjusts, who pauses, rephrases, checks in, asks whether something landed, is a dramatically more effective communicator than one who delivers a polished, prepared monologue without attending to whether it is actually being received. Communication is interactive. It is a loop, not a one-way transmission. Using the feedback that is available to you in real time, the nods, the frowns, the slight tilts of the head, the brief looks of puzzlement, is one of the most powerful things any communicator can do. Notice what every single one of these things has in common. None of them require you to change your accent, but every one of them is about behavior, about choices you can make right now, in any conversation, in any context. And behavior is far more accessible, far more immediately changeable, far more under your control than accent. You can practice speaking more slowly today in your very next conversation. You can practice pausing today. You can practice projecting your voice today. You cannot change your accent today. And more importantly, as I hope this course is making clear, you do not need to. Let us talk about something that rarely comes up in discussions about accent and language learning, even though it sits at the center of everything. Your accent is not just a communication variable. It is not just a phonological pattern that can be adjusted and optimized for better performance. It is part of who you are. When you speak with a particular accent, you are carrying traces of every linguistic community you have ever belonged to. You are carrying your childhood, the voices of your parents and grandparents, the sounds you heard before you had language to name them. You are carrying the rhythms of the language you dreamed in before you had English. You are carrying geography, the specific sounds of a particular place on Earth, sounds shaped by history and climate and culture and migration and centuries of human life. You are carrying a people. Your accent does not just identify you, it identifies you with something. Your accent is, in a very real sense, or a kind of autobiography. It tells a story about where you have been, what you have experienced, what has formed you. And if you have learned English as a second language, your accent tells an additional and important story. The story of someone who crossed a linguistic border, who took on the enormous cognitive and emotional challenge of acquiring a new language as an adult, who operates daily in a code that is not native to them. That story is not a story of deficiency. It is not a story of approximation or failure. It is a story of genuine, hard-won achievement. I want to pause on that for a moment because I think most people who are self-conscious about their accents have never thought about it this way. They have spent years, sometimes decades, thinking about what their accent might cost them. They have worried about what people think when they hear it. They have tried to minimize it, hide it, manage it, apologize for it. What they have almost never done is stop to consider what their accent carries with it, what it signals, what story it tells, what it says about the particular and irreplaceable person who has this voice. There is a concept in linguistics called linguistic capital, the social and cultural value that is embedded in particular ways of speaking. For a long time in Western academic and professional contexts, the only variety of English credited with high linguistic capital was standard native speaker English, specifically prestige native speaker varieties associated with formal education and elite institutions. All other varieties were implicitly or explicitly treated as deficits, as lesser, as things to overcome. But the understanding of linguistic capital has expanded and deepened significantly in a genuinely globalized world in which commerce, science, diplomacy, technology, and culture operate across national and linguistic borders. The ability to operate across those borders has genuine, substantial value. If you are a non-native English speaker, You possess something that no monolingual native English speaker automatically possesses: bilingual or multilingual competence. You have a cognitive architecture that allows you to move between language systems, to think in more than one code, to understand meaning from multiple linguistic angles. And you have cultural intelligence that comes from having navigated more than one way of understanding and constructing the world. You have an empathy for the experience of speaking in a foreign language that makes you, in many contexts, a more patient, more collaborative, more effective communicator than someone who has only ever communicated in their mother tongue. These are not small things. They are genuinely significant human competencies, and your accent is, in part, a marker of them. It tells the people around you that you are a person of multiple worlds, someone who has traveled linguistically and culturally in ways that many people never will. Now, I am not suggesting that linguistic identity is simple or uncomplicated, because it is not. For many people, their accent is caught up in deeply painful experiences, experiences of discrimination, of mockery, of being treated as less intelligent or less worthy because of the way they speak. For some people, on their native language and the accent it produces in English are associated not with warmth and pride, but with trauma, with circumstances they have worked hard to move beyond, with a past they would rather not carry forward. For these people, the desire to speak differently is not simply about managing social optics. It can be about survival, about the pursuit of a self they have not yet been allowed to fully inhabit. I hear that, and I hold it with care. And I'm not here to tell anyone what relationship they should have with their linguistic background. What I am doing is pushing back firmly with evidence against the automatic, unexamined assumption that speaking with a non-native accent is a problem that requires solving. That assumption is not neutral. It is ideological. It serves particular interests, and it has been extracting a cost from people that they were never told about when they signed up to pay it. What it costs them, and specifically, is this: the energy that goes into hiding an accent, into performing a different voice, into managing the constant anxiety of that performance, is energy that is not going into the actual communication. It is not going into the content, the ideas, the argument, the connection, the humanity of the exchange. It is going into theater, and the communication often suffers as a direct result, not because of the accent, but because the speaker is so fully occupied with managing their voice that they cannot be fully present to what they are actually trying to say. I want to do a thought experiment with you, and I want you to take it seriously. Think about the last time you felt anxious about your accent. Bring the scenario into focus. Maybe it was a presentation at work. Maybe it was a difficult conversation with a client or a manager. Maybe it was a job interview, or a casual gathering where you felt out of place, or a phone call you had been dreading. Whatever the scenario, bring it back. Now I want to ask you, who exactly were you afraid of? Whose reaction in that room or on that call were you most dreading? Who was the person or the presence you were performing for, or rather, hiding from? For most people, when they really examine this question, the answer is a projection. It is not a specific and real individual whose actual opinions they know from experience. It is a composite figure, an imagined critic who represents the worst case version of every negative response they have ever received or feared receiving. This imagined critic is acutely attuned to every deviation from standard pronunciation. They are instantly dismissive of non-native speech. They are sitting there cataloging each non-standard vowel, each unfamiliar intonation pattern, each place where the rhythm is not quite what they are used to, and they are profoundly unimpressed. Here is the thing about that imagined critic. They do not actually exist in most of the rooms you are afraid of. The research on how listeners process accented speech tells us something very important about what ordinary listeners are actually focused on during a conversation. They are focused on meaning. They are trying to understand what you are telling them. They are extracting information and making connections, forming their own responses, tracking the thread of the exchange. They are not sitting there with a mental scorecard, tallying the accuracy of your vowel sounds and comparing them to some internal standard. In fact, multiple studies show that listeners, particularly those who have any meaningful exposure to accented speech, which in today's globalized or diverse world is the majority of people, adapt quickly to unfamiliar accents and pay progressively less attention to the accent as a conversation continues. The accent becomes background noise. The meaning comes to the foreground. The brain is efficient. It focuses on what is relevant. And accent, once it has been calibrated to, is typically not relevant to the meaning. Furthermore, the attitudes people hold toward non-native accents are far more nuanced and far more positive than accent-anxious speakers tend to assume. In survey after survey, in study after study, listeners describe non-native accents as interesting, warm, distinctive, evocative, and associated with positive qualities like travel, cultural experience, and the richness of a multilingual world. Yes, some people carry bias. Yes, some institutional environments are less welcoming than others, and we should be clear-eyed about that. But the average listener in an average everyday interaction is not your enemy. They are someone who wants to understand what you are saying and who is, in all likelihood, far more comfortable with your accent than you are. This gap between how accent-anxious speakers imagine they are being perceived and how they are actually being perceived is one of the most consistently replicated findings in the psychology of social anxiety. And researchers call it the spotlight effect. It operates across many domains of self-consciousness, not just around accents and language. We systematically and significantly overestimate how much other people are focused on our flaws, our stumbles, our deviations from some imagined norm. We imagine ourselves under a bright, unforgiving spotlight, every imperfection visible and attended to, when in reality, other people are mostly occupied with their own concerns, their own conversations, or their own performance anxieties. You are not under a spotlight. You are in a conversation. The distinction matters enormously. I also want to address the listeners who do react negatively to your accent because they exist, and if you have encountered them, those encounters are real and their impact is real. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Here is what I want you to remember about those encounters. A listener's negative reaction to your accent tells you something about them, and it tells you about the limits of their exposure. It tells you about the biases they carry. It tells you about the particular cultural or institutional context in which that reaction occurred. It tells you nothing reliable about your competence as a communicator, your intelligence as a thinker, your worth as a person, or even your clarity as a speaker. When someone dismisses you because of your accent, They have committed a category error. They have substituted sound for substance, and they have evaluated the container rather than the contents. This is their limitation. It is a limitation you may sometimes need to navigate carefully in certain environments. We will talk about how. But it is not a reflection of reality. And it certainly is not information about you that you need to carry forward into every subsequent speaking situation. Let us get concrete and talk about confidence, because all the conceptual reframing in the world does not change what you feel in the specific moment when you need to speak and the anxiety rises in your chest. So let us talk about how confidence actually works, where it comes from, and what you can do to build more of it in a way that is real and lasting. Confidence in speaking, in any language, with any accent, is not a fixed personality trait that some people have at birth and others simply lack. It is a dynamic state that fluctuates based on experience, preparation, environment, and most importantly, the story you are telling yourself in real time while you speak. Here is how the confidence loop works in its negative form. You enter a speaking situation already carrying anxiety about how you sound. That anxiety elevates your self-monitoring. You are paying more attention to yourself, to your sounds, to your performance than you are to the conversation. The elevated self-monitoring makes you more aware of every stumble, every hesitation, every moment that does not feel perfect. You notice these things in real time and register them as failures. That registration increases your anxiety, which increases your self-monitoring, which makes you notice more things to be anxious about. And around the loop you go in an increasingly tight spiral. The positive version of this loop runs the same mechanism in reverse. And you enter a speaking situation with relative calm, perhaps because the stakes feel manageable, or because you know this person, or because you are genuinely engaged in the topic. You are more focused on your listener than on yourself. You notice when the communication is working, when the listener nods, when they follow your point, when they respond in a way that shows they understood you clearly. You register these moments as successes. That registration builds confidence, which decreases self-monitoring, which allows you to be more present and more natural, which makes you more effective as a communicator, which generates more moments of connection and success. The positive loop, once started, reinforces itself. The question is, how do you shift from the negative loop to the positive one, particularly when the negative loop has been running for years? The first and most important tool is attention management. When you are speaking, on deliberately and consciously, move your attention from yourself to your listener. Instead of thinking, how do I sound right now? Ask yourself, what does this person need from me in this moment? That shift of attention is not just a psychological trick. It is actually the foundation of good communication. Focusing on your listener makes you more responsive to them, more adaptive to their needs, more genuinely present in the exchange. And paradoxically, it makes you sound better, is because you stop over monitoring and allow your speech to flow with the natural fluency that comes from being genuinely engaged rather than performing. The second tool is preparation that serves you without constraining you, not over preparation. The kind where you script every word and then become rigid and anxious whenever the conversation deviates from your script, but functional, confidence-building preparation. The knowing your material well enough that the content itself is not the bottleneck. When you are comfortable and familiar with what you want to say, your brain has more resources available for the communication itself, for managing the pace, for reading the room, for being responsive. You are not spending all your cognitive energy on remembering what comes next and have nothing left for how to be present while you say it. The third tool is reframing errors with radical honesty. Every speaker makes errors. Every single one, without exception, native and non-native, experienced and inexperienced, casual and formal. Native speakers mispronounce words. They lose their train of thought mid-sentence. They say the wrong word and have to correct themselves. They talk over people, trail off, contradict themselves. These errors do not typically derail conversations. They barely register with most listeners. But non-native speakers, and because they are hypervigilant about their performance, notice every error they make and treat it as significant evidence of failure or inadequacy. The next time you stumble in English, and you will stumble because everyone does, try to do what a confident native speaker would automatically do. Nothing. Just keep going. The error was not catastrophic. The conversation is still alive. The world didn't end. Move on. The fourth tool is incremental, real-world exposure. Confidence is built through accumulated experience, not through preparation alone. It requires actual, embodied evidence that speaking is safe, that you can open your mouth, produce words, be received, be understood, and come out the other side intact. Your nervous system cannot be convinced of this through reasoning alone, no matter how compelling the reasoning is. It needs to experience it repeatedly in the flesh and start with lower stakes speaking situations, conversations where you feel relatively comfortable, where you know the people, where the consequences of imperfection are minimal. Let success at those levels become your platform. Then gradually extend into higher stakes territory, carrying the accumulated evidence with you. The fifth tool is body engagement. Your voice and your body are not separate systems. They are one system. When your shoulders are hunched forward, your chest is compressed with an open, grounded posture. When you, with an open, grounded posture, when you breathe from your diaphragm rather than your upper chest, when you release the tension in your jaw and your throat and your shoulders, your voice opens up. It carries further. It sounds more grounded and more present. The remarkable thing about this is that it works even when you do not feel confident. When you can adopt the physical posture of confidence before the internal experience has arrived, and in doing so, you often bring the internal experience along with you. The body teaches the mind what the mind couldn't teach the body through argument. I need to spend dedicated time on a belief that is rarely spoken aloud, but deeply and pervasively influences how non-native speakers relate to their own English. It is the belief that their English, the variety they actually speak and live in, with its accent and its occasional direct influences from their first language and its non-standard constructions, is a lesser, thinner, reduced version of real English, that they are working with an incomplete instrument, that native speakers are operating from a fuller, richer, more legitimate place, and that non-native speakers are always, on some level, approximating the real thing. This belief is wrong. I want to explain why, thoroughly and clearly, because the explanation matters. Language is not a fixed object. It is not a complete and authoritative set of rules that native speakers possess in their entirety, and that everyone else is in the process of catching up to. Language is a living, dynamic, continuously evolving system. It is collectively negotiated and renegotiated by its users, all of its users, constantly. It changes, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always. What counts as correct English has changed dramatically across the centuries and continues to change. Features of language that were considered errors by prescriptive grammarians 2 generations ago are entirely standard today. Features that were standard a century ago are now archaic. Language doesn't have a fixed truth that can be violated. It has conventions that can be departed from, with varying social consequences depending on context. And when a speaker who grew up with Tamil or Swahili or Vietnamese or Arabic or Mandarin or Polish uses English, they are not deficiently failing to use English the right way. They are using English the way humans have always used language, adapting it to their cognitive architecture, bringing their native linguistic categories to bear on a new system, creating something that serves their communicative needs. This is not a failure mode of language acquisition, and this is how all language contact works across history. Every major variety of English that exists today, British, American, Australian, Singaporean, Nigerian, developed through exactly this process, through contact, through adaptation, through the influence of other languages and ways of speaking. Many of the features of non-native Englishes that are sometimes dismissed as errors are actually systematic, rule-governed, and predictable, and they are not random mistakes produced by insufficient knowledge. They reflect the influence of another fully formed, internally consistent linguistic system. When a speaker of a language without a definite article sometimes omits the English the, they are not being careless or ignorant. They are navigating a grammatical distinction that their first language simply does not make using the categories available to them. The so-called error is actually evidence of the complex, our intelligent cognitive work happening constantly in the background. It deserves respect, not correction. Furthermore, many features that are considered standard and correct in prestigious native speaker Englishes are themselves completely arbitrary from a logical standpoint. There is nothing inherently more logical or more correct about the English system of prepositions, which is famously idiosyncratic and which no logical system would independently produce. There is nothing inherently superior about the English article system, or the English irregular verb system, or any of the other features that non-native speakers find difficult and that native speakers deploy automatically without having to think about them. These are the particular conventions of this particular language variety. They are standard, but standard is not the same as correct, and correct is not the same as superior. And this distinction matters profoundly because it shapes the story you tell yourself about your English. If you believe, as the dominant cultural narrative suggests, that native speaker English is correct and your English is a flawed approximation of it, then you will always be measuring yourself against a standard that you cannot fully meet. You will always be behind. You will always be not quite there yet. You will always feel inadequate, like regardless of how capable a communicator you actually are. But if you understand that your English is a legitimate variety of world English, one that works differently in some places, that carries its own influences and its own character, but that is equally valid as a vehicle for communication, then you can take a very different stance. You can own your English. You can speak it with authority rather than apology. This does not mean there is no value in expanding your vocabulary, or refining your grammar, or developing greater fluency and range. Of course, there is value in that. Language learning is a lifelong process and a genuinely enriching one. But there is a world of difference in experience, in psychology, in outcomes between learning because you want to expand your capacity and learning because you believe what you already have is not enough and you must fix yourself before you deserve to be heard. The first orientation is empowering, the second is exhausting, and it produces not growth but shame. All of the conceptual reframing in the world does not change the fact that you have real world situations you need to navigate, meetings to attend, calls to make, presentations to deliver, relationships to build, and that how you communicate in those situations has real consequences for your professional and personal life. So let us spend significant time in the concrete and the practical. The workplace is where most of the stress around accents concentrates, and so let us start there. The workplace presents a particular kind of challenge because the stakes are real and the social dynamics are complex. There are hierarchies to navigate, impressions to manage, and professional consequences attached to how you are perceived. The pressure to communicate effectively is genuine and ongoing, and yet, that many of the strategies that anxious speakers adopt to manage accent anxiety in the workplace are actively counterproductive. The most common counterproductive strategy is silence. People who are anxious about their accents speak less. They hold back in meetings, even when they have something to contribute. They avoid the phone and default to email for every communication that can possibly be handled in writing. And they let other people take the conversational lead, even when they are the most qualified person in the room. The logic seems intuitively reasonable. If you speak less, there are fewer opportunities to be misunderstood or judged. But the actual effect is the opposite of what people hope for. When you consistently hold back, you become less visible. Your ideas are less often in the room. You are perceived as less engaged, less invested, less confident, and less knowledgeable. Not because you are these things, but because the behavior of holding back produces these impressions. You are passed over for opportunities, for leadership, for recognition, not primarily because of your accent, but because you have systematically made yourself small in the spaces where visibility matters. The accent anxiety intended to protect you has instead undermined you in a more fundamental way. The more effective strategy is what I call strategic visibility, and this means deliberately putting yourself in conversations, especially lower stakes, more casual ones where you can build without great pressure, and consistently contributing. It means building a track record of valuable, clear communication that people come to associate with your name. It means investing in relationships with colleagues who know your work directly and who can speak to your contributions in the rooms where you are not present. And when people know what you are worth, when they know your ideas, your judgment, your reliability, your accent becomes context rather than obstacle. It becomes one feature of a person they already have good reasons to value. The repeat request deserves specific attention because it is one of the moments that most reliably triggers acute accent anxiety. Someone asks you to say something again because they did not catch it. Everything about the situation, the pause, and the slightly awkward adjustment, the fact that something went wrong, activates the threat response. But let us look at this moment clearly, stripped of the anxiety narrative around it. Someone is asking you to repeat yourself because they want to understand you. That is, if you think about it carefully, an expression of genuine interest in what you have to say. It is an invitation to communication, not a rejection of it. And the appropriate and effective response is to repeat yourself, perhaps a little more slowly, perhaps with a slight rephrasing, perhaps supplemented with a written note if the context allows. What it is decidedly not is a signal that you should shrink, apologize excessively, abandon your train of thought, or stop speaking. A misunderstanding is not a verdict on your English. It is a data point in a conversation, and conversations are full of data points. So phone and video communication deserve special attention because many people find them significantly harder than face-to-face interaction, and that difficulty is both real and manageable. Without the full visual support of face-to-face communication, lip reading, facial expressions, gesture, posture, listeners rely entirely on the audio signal. And that audio signal, especially on phone calls and on many video platforms, is compressed, sometimes degraded, and stripped of much of the richness of real-life speech. For speakers whose phonological patterns are less immediately familiar to a given listener, this can create genuine added difficulty. Practical strategies include speaking at a slightly more deliberate pace than you would in person, using slightly more explicit structure and signposting so the listener always knows where you are in the conversation. Following up important voice conversations with a brief written summary to ensure alignment on key points, and not hesitating to ask whether you are being understood clearly, which is not weakness but good communication practice. These are adjustments that make communication more effective for everyone, and they cost you nothing in terms of how you come across. Public speaking and presentations generate enormous anxiety for many non-native speakers, but I want to offer some reframing that I hope is genuinely useful. A presentation is, in many ways, a more controlled communication environment than spontaneous conversation. You know in advance what you are going to say. You have time to prepare and to practice, not just the content, but the delivery, the pacing, the pauses, the moments of emphasis. You are the only person speaking. The variables are more manageable than in live, improvised conversation. And what makes presentations feel high stakes is the sense of being evaluated, of being visible, of being the object of other people's attention. But consider carefully what audiences actually want from a presentation. They want information that is useful to them. They want clarity, the sense that they can follow the thread without enormous effort. They want to leave the room having learned or understood something valuable. They want to feel that the speaker cares about communicating with them and not just at them. Not one of those things requires a particular accent. Every one of them is available to any speaker who has done their preparation, cares about their audience, and is genuinely present in the room. Casual social situations are often overlooked in professional discussions about accent and communication, but they carry their own particular challenges. The workplace has structure, clear purpose, defined roles. Social situations are more fluid, faster paced, less predictable, and more laden with idiom and cultural reference and humor, more dependent on the implicit codes of a particular community. For many non-native speakers, casual English conversation feels significantly harder than formal or professional communication, and this itself generates anxiety. Some of the difficulty is genuinely linguistic, idiomatic expressions, cultural references, humor that depends on shared background. These accumulate over time through exposure and experience, and you cannot always look them up in advance. But some of the difficulty is also perceptual and psychological. The goal in a work presentation is reasonably clear. The goal in a social conversation is more ambiguous: connection, belonging, being liked, being seen as good company. And that ambiguity, combined with the genuine uncertainty of social situations, can make the anxiety sharper rather than lighter. And what I want to say about casual social English is simply this: give yourself permission to be learning in public. You will not always catch every cultural reference. You will sometimes not immediately understand a joke or understand it a beat after everyone else has laughed. This is normal. This happens to everyone who is new to a particular cultural context, including native English speakers who are new to a different community, a different region, a different professional world. People enjoy explaining the things they People enjoy explaining the things they find funny and interesting. Your questions can create connection rather than distance, because accent reduction is a substantial and growing industry, and because its promises are appealing to people in genuine distress about how they sound. I want to spend time examining the most common claims made about it. Some of those claims deserve serious scrutiny. Myth number one: you need to sound like a native speaker to be successful. This is perhaps the most pervasive and most damaging myth in the entire space of English language learning. It is also demonstrably, empirically false. Across every professional field, every industry, every level of organizational hierarchy, every cultural domain, and there are non-native English speakers who are enormously, enviably successful. Scientists, executives, academics, artists, public intellectuals, entrepreneurs, political leaders, cultural figures, people whose accents are clearly and unmistakably audible, people whose speech clearly bears the marks of another linguistic origin, and who communicate effectively, lead organizations, inspire audiences, build companies, and do all the other things that constitute success at the highest levels. And the myth that native speaker sound is a prerequisite for professional or social success is not supported by the evidence. It is supported by the bias of particular institutions, particular industries, particular cultural and national contexts. And it is worth asking yourself which specific context you operate in, what their actual standards are, and whether those standards are as universal and as immovable as they may sometimes feel. The myth number two: accent reduction courses will solve your communication problems. The implied promise of most accent reduction programs is this: if you work hard enough, long enough, on the sounds of your speech, you will eventually be understood and accepted in the ways you have always wanted to be. This promise is rarely delivered on for several reasons that are worth understanding clearly. The adult phonological acquisition, the business of actually changing the sounds you produce when you speak, is genuinely physiologically difficult. The human brain is most plastic for phonological learning during early childhood. After puberty, the neural pathways for speech production become significantly less flexible. This does not mean it is impossible to shift some aspects of your accent as an adult. With sustained, intensive, properly designed work, and some people do achieve meaningful changes to specific sounds. But it does mean the process is slow, requires enormous effort over a long period, and results are typically partial and specific rather than comprehensive. You are very unlikely, regardless of how diligently you work, to eliminate all traces of your native language from your English pronunciation. More importantly, and this is crucial, the communication challenges that non-native speakers most commonly face are rarely primarily phonological. They are more often about rate of speech, about confidence, about organizational clarity, about the interpersonal dynamics of communication. Focusing intensive effort on sounds while leaving these other factors unaddressed is solving the wrong problem. It is replacing a leaky roof while the foundation is cracking. And there is a third concern that I want to name directly. The cognitive load required to consciously manage an altered phonological system in real-time conversation is significant. Many people who have done extensive accent reduction training report feeling more anxious, not less, when they speak English in real situations, because they are now managing two simultaneous performances: what to say and how to produce each sound. On the mental resources available for the actual communication are reduced, and the communication often becomes less natural, less fluent, less genuinely connected as a result. None of this means that all pronunciation work is without value. If there are specific sounds or specific features of your speech that consistently produce genuine misunderstanding, not discomfort, not mismatch with listener expectations, but genuine, recurring communication breakdowns, then targeted work on those specific features with a qualified speech pathologist can be genuinely useful. The key words are targeted and specific, not wholesale accent replacement, specific clarity improvements. Myth number 3: native speakers simply cannot understand non-native accents. This is false for most listeners in most contexts. As I discussed in an earlier chapter, human brains adapt quickly to unfamiliar accent patterns. Most adults in most English-speaking environments have had significant exposure to a range of non-native accents through work, education, media, and daily life. They are quite capable of understanding those accents with modest attention and effort. The myth of native speaker incomprehension persists, in part because of experiences in particularly high-stress speaking situations, job interviews, high-stakes presentations, on first meetings, where listener attention is heightened but speaker anxiety is also elevated, and where the combination produces more communication difficulty than either factor alone would generate. These high-stress moments are not representative of ordinary communication, and attributing to accent what is actually largely a product of mutual stress and heightened self-monitoring is a significant and costly misattribution. So myth number 4: your accent will improve naturally just by speaking English more. Partly true, partly misleading. Your fluency, your speed, your ease, your access to vocabulary, your confidence with the language as a whole does tend to improve with use and exposure. But the specific phonological patterns that make up your accent tend to stabilize fairly early after initial acquisition and then remain relatively constant without deliberate, focused effort to change them. And if you're waiting for your accent to gradually fix itself through sheer exposure and practice, that expectation may not be met. What does reliably improve with practice and experience is your relationship with your accent, your comfort with it, your ease within it, your confidence in using it without apology. You become less self-conscious. You develop effective strategies for managing the situations where it creates friction. How you learn which environments are genuinely welcoming and how to navigate those that are not. This is not accent improvement in the phonological sense. It is something more important and more durable. It is self-acceptance translated into daily practice. We have covered a great deal of ground in this masterclass. We have talked about the psychology of accent anxiety, about what research shows us, about the distinction between accent and clarity, about linguistic identity, more about practical strategies, about myths that do not serve you. Now I want to bring it all together and talk about something that encompasses all of it: your communication identity. Your communication identity is the stance you take toward yourself as a communicator. It is the set of beliefs you carry, consciously and unconsciously, about what kind of speaker you are, what you are capable of, whether you deserve to take up space in conversations, and whether the things you have to say are worth the listening. It is, in a very direct way, the most important single factor in your effectiveness as a communicator. More important than accent, more important than vocabulary, more important even than fluency. People with strong communication identities communicate more effectively across the board. These are not necessarily extroverts, or people who are naturally loud, or people who never feel nervous, and they are people who have arrived at a settled, grounded sense of their own right to speak and be heard. This sense of entitlement, I use that word deliberately and positively, makes them more willing to take up space in conversations, more willing to ask for clarification without embarrassment, more willing to repair communication when it breaks down rather than shutting down, more willing to persist when they are not immediately understood, or more willing to own their ideas fully and express them with conviction. All of these things make them better communicators, and they all flow from the same source: the belief that they belong in the conversation. Building a strong communication identity as a non-native English speaker requires, first and foremost, accepting that you are already a communicator, not a communicator in training who will be ready when your accent is better, not a communicator who will be legitimate when your grammar is perfect. A communicator right now, today, with the voice you actually have, in the language you actually speak. This sounds simple. It is not simple. For many people, the acceptance of "I am a communicator now, and my voice is worth hearing now" conflicts directly with years, sometimes decades, of messaging from schools, workplaces, families, and cultural environments that said, "Not yet." That said, "Once your English improves." That said, "You would be heard more clearly if you sounded more like us." Those messages are deeply embedded. They are not easily unlearned, but they can be unlearned. They have been unlearned by countless people before you. And this course is part of that process. One of the most powerful ways to begin that unlearning is through community and finding other non-native English speakers, particularly those who communicate with ease, confidence, and effectiveness, and observing how they navigate the same terrain you are navigating. Talking with them, sharing experiences. There is something profoundly de-isolating about the recognition that what you experience is widely shared among capable, intelligent, accomplished people. That you are not uniquely broken, that the challenge is structural, not personal. Now, another powerful tool is deliberate attention to your own communication history. Think about a time, a specific, concrete, remembered time, when you communicated something difficult in English and it worked. A time when you were genuinely understood. A time when you made a real connection. A time when your words landed the way you intended them to, and something meaningful happened as a result. Your accent was present in that moment. It did not stop you. File that away. On your brain needs that evidence. Give it every piece you can find. And a third tool is changing the language you use to describe yourself as a speaker. If you habitually say things like, "My English is not so good," or "I apologize for my accent," or "Please excuse my pronunciation, I know it is not great," I want you to understand that you are not expressing humility. You are actively programming yourself and the people around you to expect and find deficiency, which you are volunteering a negative frame before anyone else has offered one. Stop doing this. You do not need to overclaim or perform false confidence. But there is a significant and meaningful difference between "I apologize for my English" and "I'll let you know if I need to rephrase something." One positions you as someone with a problem who is asking for patience. The other positions you as someone with a system who is offering collaboration. Choose the second. And in this chapter, I want to do something a little different. I want to give you a script. Not a script for how to speak English, but a script for the ongoing internal conversation you can have with the part of your mind that shows up every time you are about to speak and starts running its familiar catalog of things that could go wrong. You know this voice. It has its own particular tone. It might sound like a teacher who once corrected you harshly in front of others, though it might sound like a colleague who gave you a dismissive look when you stumbled over something. It might sound like a parent who told you that your English was not good enough, or like a stranger who repeated themselves back to you with an exaggerated imitation of your accent. Or it might sound like no one in particular, just a formless, ambient pressure, a constant low hum of threat that says, "Be careful, be quiet, be smaller, be less." And the first thing I want to say about this voice is that it is not your enemy. I know it can feel that way. But this voice learned somewhere along the line that speaking carried risk. It was trying to protect you from pain. It has been on guard ever since, doing its job. The problem is not its intention. The problem is that it is working from outdated information. It does not know what the research on listener adaptation says. It does not know about the spotlight effect. It has not heard this masterclass. It is running old code, on old data, with old predictions that no longer serve you. And so, here is what I want you to do when it speaks. Here is the conversation I want you to learn to have. When the voice says, "They will not understand you," respond, "Maybe not immediately." And that is okay. We will work it out together. That is what communication does. When the voice says, "You sound so foreign," respond, "Yes, I come from somewhere. That is not a problem, as that is information about who I am." When the voice says, "Your accent is going to embarrass you," respond, "My accent is part of my voice. My voice is how I communicate. I am going to communicate anyway." When the voice says, "You should just stay quiet," respond, "No, I have something to say, and the person I am speaking to deserves the chance to hear it." When the voice says, "What if they ask you to repeat yourself?" respond, "Then I will repeat myself." People ask for clarification in every conversation. It is part of talking. It is not the end of anything. When the voice says, "Native speakers never have to deal with this," respond, "Every speaker manages something When they communicate, "This is mine. I can manage it." When the voice says, "You are not good enough yet," respond, "I am good enough right now. I will always be growing, but I am good enough right now." When the voice says, "What if you stumble and everyone notices?" And respond, "People stumble. Conversations absorb it." The stumble is not the story. What I say is the story. When the voice says, "It is not worth the risk," respond, "The risk of speaking is far smaller than the cost of silence." These are not magic words. Saying them once will not silence the anxiety. The voice will come back tomorrow, and in the next difficult conversation, and in the one after that. But speaking back to it, consistently, patiently, with evidence, is a practice. It is the practice of refusing to take your anxiety's predictions at face value. It is the practice of offering your brain a different narrative again and again, until that narrative has enough weight and enough repetition to start feeling true, until it starts to become the first story rather than the second one. We are approaching the final chapters of this masterclass, and I want to say something important before we close. This is not a journey with a clear endpoint. The work we have been talking about, learning to communicate with confidence and authority in English, with the accent you actually have and the voice that is actually yours, is not a destination you arrive at after completing the right number of exercises or reaching the right number of speaking hours. It is an ongoing relationship with a part of yourself, a relationship that deepens and strengthens over time, but that never fully resolves into simple, permanent ease. And there will be good days, days when the words come easily, when you feel at home in your voice, when the anxiety does not show up at all or shows up only faintly and then passes. There will also be harder days, days when an unexpected situation activates the old anxiety, when something someone says lands badly, when you have a difficult conversation that doesn't go the way you hoped, and the inner critic gets very loud. These harder days are not regression, and not to arrive at a place where you never, not to arrive at a place where you never feel anxious about speaking. That goal is not realistic, and pursuing it will exhaust you. The goal is to have a different relationship with the anxiety when it appears, to recognize it as a familiar visitor, to understand where it comes from, to not be controlled by it, and to speak anyway, to gather it again and again, the evidence that speaking was okay, and to build slowly and cumulatively an internal archive of experience that gradually shifts your orientation from "my voice is a problem" toward "my voice is mine and I am entitled to use it." I also want to say something about the trap of comparison. One of the most corrosive habits for non-native English speakers is comparing themselves to native speakers, on as though native speaker English represents the standard against which all other English is measured and found wanting. This comparison is not useful, it is not fair, and it is not even logically coherent because native speakers are not all the same, and many of them are far less effective communicators than you are. More importantly, the comparison ignores what you bring that a native speaker does not automatically bring: the bilingual or multilingual competence, the cultural intelligence, and the empathy for difficulty, the awareness of what communication feels like when you are working at it rather than coasting on automatic. These are not nothing. They are a great deal. Your trajectory in English is not the same as a native speaker's trajectory. It does not need to be. It is yours. Build your communication identity on what you actually are, not on what you are not yet, on the things you can do, and not on the gap between your current self and some imagined future self who no longer has an accent. That future self is not coming. You are who you are, speaking as you speak, right now. And right now is more than enough to begin. Let us be concrete. Here is a set of practical exercises you can begin immediately. These are not pronunciation drills. They are confidence practices, ways of changing your relationship with speaking, not the sounds of your speech. And exercise 1, the daily speaking commitment. Every day for the next 30 days, commit to having at least one conversation in English that you initiate, not a conversation that circumstances require, a conversation that you choose. It can be brief. Ask a neighbor about their day. Comment on something to a stranger in line somewhere. Introduce yourself to someone new at work or in a class or at an event. The content is less important than the act of initiation, and you are training your brain to associate speaking with agency and choice rather than with threat and reluctant necessity. This is a small practice with significant cumulative effect. Exercise 2, the weekly recording review. Once a week, record yourself speaking for 2 to 3 minutes on any topic that genuinely interests you. Then listen back, not as a critic, but as a curious researcher. Notice what is clear. Notice what works well. Notice where your pacing is good and where your pauses are effective, where you organized something well. Write down 3 specific things you did well. If there is one thing you would improve, note it. 1, not 5, not 10. The ratio is deliberate. 3 positives to 1 growth area. This ratio is not about false positivity. It is about accurate self-assessment. People whose inner critics are very loud typically have self-assessments that are significantly skewed negative. Correcting that skew with honest, positive observation is not self-indulgence. It is calibration. Exercise 3, the repair practice. The next time there is a communication breakdown, someone asks you to repeat yourself, or clearly doesn't follow something, treat it as a deliberate practice opportunity rather than evidence of failure. Repeat yourself calmly, without apology, at a slightly more measured pace. Then continue the conversation as though nothing significant has happened. Afterward, take note. Did the world end? Did the conversation survive? Did the person respond reasonably? In almost every case, the answers will confirm what I am telling you. Communication repair is normal, it is survivable, and it is part of every conversation between any 2 people, regardless of accent or language background. Exercise 4, the spotlight audit. The next time you are mid-conversation and feel the anxiety rising around how you sound, and pause for 1 beat internally and ask, is this person actually focused on my accent right now? Or are they focused on what I am saying? In most cases, if you answer honestly, the answer is the latter. They are tracking the meaning. The spotlight is in your imagination, not on you. Use this awareness to redirect your own attention from your voice back to the person in front of you and the communication happening between you. Exercise 5, the ally network. Might identify 2 or 3 people in your life, colleagues, friends, family members, with whom you feel genuinely comfortable speaking English. People with whom the anxiety is minimal. These are your communication allies. When you need to prepare for something challenging, a presentation, a difficult conversation, a new professional context, practice with them first. Use their ease with your communication as evidence. Let the experience of being understood by them, of communicating naturally with them, recalibrate your internal baseline toward what is actually possible. Exercise 6. The self-introduction expansion. For many people, the moment of introduction, saying your name, saying where you are from, the moment when your accent is most immediately exposed to someone new, is the most difficult moment of any social or professional encounter. Most people rush through it, compress it, try to get it over with as quickly as possible. I want you to try the opposite. Slow down your introduction slightly. Say your name with full presence and give the other person a moment with it. Say where you're from as a fact, not a parenthetical. Own it. Where you're from is not something to apologize for or minimize. It is part of who you are. And owning it, presenting it straightforwardly, without hedging, without preemptive apology, signals to the other person that you are comfortable with yourself. People take their cue from you. I give them a good one. Exercise 7. The content shift. Whenever anxiety rises mid-conversation and you become hyper-focused on how you sound, deliberately shift your attention by asking the other person a genuine question, not as deflection, not as a technique, but as an authentic expression of curiosity about them. The moment you move from "I am being evaluated" to "I am genuinely curious about this person," your anxiety typically decreases. And this is because social anxiety is fundamentally self-directed attention. It is the experience of feeling watched and judged. Genuine curiosity is other-directed attention. You cannot fully inhabit both simultaneously. Use this whenever you need it. Exercise 8. The gratitude for difficulty. This one is more meditative, but genuinely powerful for some people. At the end of a day in which you spoke English in a challenging context, take a moment to acknowledge, just internally, need for yourself, not that you did it perfectly, but that you did it, that you showed up, that you opened your mouth in a situation where part of you did not want to, that you navigated something difficult and came through it. This is not toxic positivity. It is honest recognition of real effort. Speaking in a second language in high-stakes situations is hard. Acknowledging that it is hard and that you did it anyway matters. But I want to step briefly outside the primary frame of this course and speak directly to anyone who is not a non-native English speaker, but who has non-native speakers in their sphere, in their classrooms, in their teams, among their colleagues, in their families. The research on this is consistent, robust, and worth taking seriously. The single most powerful environmental factor in whether a non-native English speaker communicates with confidence and effectiveness is whether the people around them signal, through their behavior, their attention, their patience, and their genuine interest, that they are worth the effort. Not that they are impressive in spite of their accent, not that their English is surprisingly good, simply that they are worth listening to, that their contribution is wanted, and that the communication will be met with engagement and goodwill rather than impatience or dismissal. If you are a teacher, this means building learning environments in which non-standard varieties of English are treated as valid rather than deficient, in which the goal is expanding communicative range and competence, not replacing one way of speaking with another. And it means correcting for genuine communication failure rather than for deviation from a prestige standard that serves social purposes more than communicative ones. It means attending to the difference between an error that impedes meaning and a feature that is simply different from the standard. If you are a manager or team leader, this means creating meeting cultures in which all voices are actively invited and structurally enabled to contribute, in which slower speakers are given time rather than talked over, in which it is normalized to follow up spoken communication with written summaries so that people who process better in writing are not disadvantaged, in which you check in privately with people who seem to hold back, not to put them on the spot, but to understand what support might be useful, and in which you attend to your own discomfort with accented speech. Because discomfort, when it is present, communicates itself, and it lands. It means, most fundamentally, examining your own automatic reactions to non-native speech with honesty and rigor. Do you find yourself losing patience more quickly when you have to work slightly harder to understand someone? Do you finish people's sentences, well-intentioned, but ultimately disempowering? Do you form impressions of competence based on how someone sounds before you have fully understood what they are saying? These are not moral failures. When they are human responses rooted in cognitive shortcuts that all brains use, but they are worth noticing, worth interrogating, and worth working to counteract. Because the cost of not working against them is paid by the people around you, and that cost is substantial. The most valuable thing you can do for any speaker navigating accent, anxiety in your presence, is to be a listener who is genuinely, visibly trying to understand, not performing patience, not tolerating difficulty with barely concealed irritation. Someone who is leaning in, tracking the meaning, asking thoughtful follow-up questions, responding to the content of what is being said. That kind of listening is transformative. It does not just make the speaker feel better or more comfortable. It actually measurably improves their communication because they relax, because the feedback loop of support and response activates their best self, and because genuine reception draws out genuine expression. You have more power in this than you may realize. We have been in this masterclass together for a long time now, and I want to close it the way I opened it, directly, without decoration, speaking to you as clearly as I can. You are not bad at English. You have never been bad at English. What you have been is anxious about English. What you have been is a person who has navigated a world that, at key moments, are delivered the message that your voice is a problem, a message you did not ask for, did not deserve, and have been carrying at great personal cost for far too long. What you have also been is brave, because you kept speaking anyway, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it went imperfectly, even when the inner critic was very loud, even when someone asked you to repeat yourself and your face went hot and your throat tightened, and even when you sat in a meeting and said nothing and walked out afterward, carrying the weight of what you hadn't said. You kept showing up. You kept trying. You kept caring about the communication, about the connection, about being in the room and being part of what was happening there. That is not failure. That is courage, and it deserves to be named as such. The research will not stop all listeners from carrying bias. The reframing in this course will not eliminate every difficult moment, and the exercises will not produce an overnight transformation. Language and identity and confidence are slow things. They change gradually under the sustained pressure of many accumulated experiences through the patient, repeated application of attention and intention and practice. But here is what I know from the research and from the stories of the countless people who have navigated this journey before you. And every person who has made genuine peace with their accent, every non-native English speaker who has arrived at a place of real ease and authority in how they communicate, has done it not by erasing who they are, but by more fully becoming it, by deciding at some point that the voice they have is the voice they are going to use, that the accent they carry is not a parenthetical, not an apology, not a disclaimer to be issued before the actual content, but a legitimate, meaningful, a fully valid part of their expression, that the story in their voice is worth telling. You have that option. You have always had that option. Every day that you speak, you are exercising it, even if it doesn't yet feel that way. Your accent is not an obstacle to being understood. It is part of what makes you worth understanding. Go speak.